The 30% tariff on South African exports to the US was a heavy blow, with many concerned about the impact on industry and jobs. But a month later, trade stats for September showed a surplus due to lower imports and higher exports, the bulk of which came from mining and agriculture, resulting in a trade surplus of almost $1.3 billion, according to the South African Revenue Service. While South Africa is still keen to negotiate lower US tariffs, it is actively engaging other markets and pushing regional trade.
Being the most industrialized nation on the African continent, investment comes in. It allows us to be able to have partnerships with the likes of China, the Gulf, Russia, to be able to create manufacturing centers here in South Africa because we're already trusted from an industrialization perspective, and then be able to create value chains across the continent. The geopolitical topsy-turviness has actually given us the ability to step back and look at what do we have, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses.
The US is South Africa's third biggest trading partner, with the European Union and China being the first and second largest trading partners. The US accounts for 7.5% of our global exports. Thus, we will continue to engage the US with a view to conclude a deal that advances the interests of both countries. South Africa seeks to conclude deals that promote value addition and industrialization, rather than extractive relations that deprive the country of the ability to beneficiate our mineral wealth by mimicking extractive colonial-era trade relations.
South Africa's trade dispute with the United States has entered a decisive and politically sensitive phase, sending ripples through Washington, global markets, and the international trade system. What began as a technical disagreement over tariffs has evolved into a moment that many analysts now describe as a strategic turning point, one that challenges long-standing assumptions about economic power, leverage, and influence. For decades, the United States has relied on tariffs as a powerful economic tool, a means of shaping trade behavior, protecting domestic industries, and applying pressure on foreign governments. But in this latest confrontation, South Africa has not only resisted that pressure, it has turned the tables. Against expectations, Pretoria has secured an export breakthrough worth an estimated $1.3 billion, strengthening its position in global markets while leaving US policymakers facing uncomfortable questions about strategy, effectiveness, and declining leverage in parts of the developing world. The story begins quietly, with a review of trade preferences under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, commonly known as AGOA. The program, designed to give African nations preferential access to US markets, has long been framed as mutually beneficial. But in recent years, Washington has grown increasingly assertive, warning that access to American markets must come with political alignment and policy compliance. South Africa, Africa's most industrialized economy, found itself under scrutiny. US officials raised concerns over trade imbalances, agricultural standards, and Pretoria's foreign policy positions, particularly its refusal to align fully with Western positions on global conflicts. Tariffs soon followed. Targeted measures were introduced on key South African exports, signaling that Washington expected concessions. Instead, South Africa recalibrated. Rather than retreating or negotiating from a position of weakness, South African trade officials accelerated talks with alternative partners across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Within months, new export corridors began to open, not only replacing lost US market share but exceeding it. Manufactured goods, processed agricultural products, automotive components, and minerals were redirected toward rapidly expanding markets with fewer political conditions and stronger long-term demand. By the time Washington realized the shift was real, the numbers told a stark story. South Africa's export revenues had surged by $1.3 billion, offsetting tariff losses and, in some sectors, outperforming previous US trade volumes. For American exporters and policymakers, the implications were sobering. The tariffs, intended to apply pressure, had instead accelerated South Africa's economic diversification. US firms lost contracts, market access narrowed, and leverage weakened. What was meant to be a warning shot had become a lesson in unintended consequences. Trade analysts say this episode highlights a broader trend. Developing economies are no longer as dependent on Western markets as they once were. Global trade flows are shifting, South-South trade is expanding, and emerging economies are increasingly confident in charting independent paths. South Africa's response also reflects a deeper political calculation. Officials in Pretoria have been clear that economic sovereignty is now a priority. In public statements, government figures emphasize that trade partnerships must be based on mutual respect rather than coercion. Washington's reaction has been mixed. Some lawmakers have called for tougher measures, arguing that failure to respond firmly risks emboldening other countries. Others have urged a reassessment, warning that punitive trade tools may no longer deliver the desired outcomes in a multipolar world. Inside U.S. agricultural and manufacturing sectors, frustration is mounting. Exporters who once relied on South African demand are now watching competitors from Asia and South America step into markets they once dominated. Economists note that this is not an isolated case. Similar patterns have emerged in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa, where countries are actively reducing exposure to single market dependence. For South Africa, the moment is being framed domestically as a validation of long-term strategy. Investment in logistics, ports, regional trade agreements, and industrial capacity has allowed the country to respond quickly, something that would have been far more difficult a decade ago. Yet risks remain. The United States remains a major economic power, and future trade relations are far from settled. Retaliatory measures could still escalate. But the balance of power has undeniably shifted. What this episode ultimately reveals is not humiliation in the theatrical sense, but something more consequential, a clear signal that traditional economic pressure tools are losing effectiveness when applied to countries with diversified trade options and strategic patience. For Washington, the lesson is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Influence can no longer be assumed. For South Africa, the message is equally clear. Economic independence is no longer a distant ambition. It is becoming a practical reality. And for the rest of the world, this clash offers a glimpse into the future of global trade, one where power is negotiated, not imposed, and where resilience matters more than alignment. As markets absorb the implications and policymakers recalibrate, one fact stands out above all others. The global trade map is being redrawn, and this time, the lines are not being drawn in Washington alone. For decades, trade between South Africa and the United States followed a familiar pattern. Raw materials flowed north, manufactured goods flowed south, and Washington largely set the terms. That balance, long taken for granted, has now been disrupted in a way few policymakers in the US expected, and fewer still were prepared for. In recent months, South Africa has quietly executed a trade maneuver that has stunned Washington, rattled US exporters, and redrawn the economics of tariffs and retaliation. What began as a technical dispute over access, compliance, and tariff thresholds has evolved into a $1.3 billion export shift, one that US officials privately describe as a strategic loss. At the center of this moment is a simple but uncomfortable reality. South Africa did not blink. When new tariff pressures and regulatory barriers emerged from the United States, aimed at protecting domestic producers and tightening trade leverage, Pretoria responded not with public outrage, but with calculation. Rather than plead for exemptions or escalate rhetorically, South Africa accelerated trade diversification, redirected supply chains, and secured alternative markets with speed that surprised even its partners. By the time Washington realized the implications, the trade had already moved. The result is a rare reversal in modern trade politics, a developing economy not only absorbing tariff pressure from a superpower, but turning it into a measurable export victory, one now estimated at $1.3 billion in redirected trade value. To understand why this moment matters, one must understand the history behind it. For years, South Africa benefited from preferential access to US markets under various trade frameworks, including duty-free quotas and sector-specific agreements. These arrangements were often framed as tools of development, but they also served US strategic interests, anchoring influence, shaping supply chains, and reinforcing political alignment. But as global politics hardened, trade became less about cooperation and more about leverage. Washington's tariff posture shifted. Domestic pressures mounted. Strategic industries were protected. Compliance standards tightened. And in several sectors, agriculture, processed foods, industrial components, and select manufactured goods, South African exporters suddenly faced new barriers. The assumption in Washington was familiar. Pressure would produce concessions. Instead, it produced an exit. Within weeks of tariff escalation, South African trade officials initiated negotiations elsewhere. Existing relationships with Asia, the Middle East, and intra-African partners were activated. Logistics were rerouted. Pricing strategies adjusted. Currency advantages exploited. And critically, Long-term supply commitments were secured before US counterparts could respond. By the time American exporters and lawmakers raised alarms, South African goods were already filling shelves, factories, and ports elsewhere. The numbers tell a stark story. Trade analysts estimate that sectors affected by US tariff pressure, particularly agricultural exports, processed goods, and select industrial inputs, have generated over $1.3 billion in alternative export revenue within a single cycle. That figure represents not just recovery, but net gain. For Washington, the shock was not simply economic. It was strategic. Because tariffs are meant to signal strength. They are tools of influence. And influence only works when the other side cannot walk away. South Africa did. In private briefings, US trade officials acknowledged that the speed of the shift caught them off guard. Supply chains that were assumed to be dependent turned out to be flexible. Markets assumed to be irreplaceable were not. And leverage assumed to be decisive evaporated. This is where the narrative changes. Because this was not merely about South Africa protecting its exports. It was about South Africa redefining its position. Pretoria's response sent a signal far beyond the US-South Africa relationship. It demonstrated that mid-sized economies with diversified partners can absorb tariff pressure without capitulation. That market access is no longer monopolized by the West. And that trade punishment now carries real risk for the punisher. For years, African economies were warned that defying major trade powers would bring isolation. This episode suggests the opposite may now be true. As South Africa rerouted exports, new partners stepped in eagerly. Asian buyers expanded contracts. Middle Eastern importers locked in long-term supply. Regional African trade surged under continental frameworks designed precisely for moments like this. What emerged was a multipolar trade response, one that diluted US influence not through confrontation, but through redundancy. And redundancy is the enemy of leverage. The political response in Washington reflected this unease. Lawmakers demanded reviews. Committees held hearings. Industry groups warned of lost access and shrinking competitiveness. Agricultural exporters in particular raised concerns that once lost, market share would be difficult to reclaim. The word humiliation was not used publicly, but privately, frustration ran deep. Because tariffs are supposed to force behavior change. In this case, they accelerated independence. South African officials, for their part, maintained a careful tone. No victory laps. No inflammatory statements. Just data. Exports up. Markets diversified. Growth stabilized. In briefings, South African trade representatives emphasized that this was not retaliation, it was adaptation. That their economy could no longer hinge on a single market's political mood. And that resilience required options. This framing mattered. Because it denied Washington the narrative of confrontation. There was no enemy to confront, only a reality to accept. And that reality is reshaping global trade. Across emerging markets, policymakers are studying this case closely. The lesson is clear. When alternatives exist, tariffs lose teeth. When supply chains diversify, pressure diffuses. And when markets compete, power shifts. This does not mean the United States is losing its role in global trade. Far from it. But it does mean that influence must now be earned, not enforced. The South Africa episode underscores a broader transformation underway. Trade is no longer a one-way hierarchy. It is a network. And in networks, power flows around obstacles. For American exporters, the concern is not the immediate $1.3 billion figure, though that alone is significant. It is the precedent. Once supply chains adapt, they rarely revert fully. Relationships, once established elsewhere, deepen. Market share lost today becomes loyalty lost tomorrow. For South Africa, the implications are equally profound. This moment validates a long-debated strategy, diversification over dependence. It strengthens the case for regional trade. It emboldens negotiators. And it signals that economic sovereignty need not come at the cost of growth. But it also brings responsibility. Diversification demands consistency. New partners expect reliability. Infrastructure must keep pace. Standards must be met. And political stability becomes even more critical when markets multiply. Still, for now, the outcome is undeniable. A tariff intended to constrain ended up catalyzing expansion. A pressure tactic intended to assert dominance revealed vulnerability. And a relationship assumed to be asymmetrical proved far more balanced than expected. In Washington, Conversations are quietly shifting. Trade strategy reviews are underway. Tariff frameworks are being reassessed. And there is growing recognition that economic influence in the 21st century cannot rely on blunt instruments alone. Because the world has options now. And South Africa just proved it. What happens next will define more than a bilateral dispute. It will shape how power is exercised in a global economy no longer centered on a single axis. For policymakers, the message is sobering. For emerging markets, it is empowering. And for the global trade system, it marks another step away from coercion and toward competition. Whether Washington adapts or resists remains to be seen. But one thing is already clear. The era when tariffs guaranteed submission is over. And South Africa's $1.3 billion export win may be remembered as one of the moments that proved it.